Hello and welcome to the Roundtable podcast. I am Shogun. I want to thank the live audience for attending. I want to thank Finbol's Commune, a Discord server you can find probably through the politics tag or Discord, Finbol's Commune. And we are, of course, the Roundtable Discord server, who you can find through the conspiracy tag of Discord or Google Roundtable Discord. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all social media, YouTube, and the podcast soon on Podcast Addict and Podbean. So join us on Discord, just Google Roundtable Discord server. That being said, special thank you to all the recorders. Special thank you to our two debaters. Representing the Roundtable Discord server, we have Mobius1, my friend Mobi, and he will be arguing Stalin bad. And on the other side, we have our good friend MakaroniX from Finbol's Commune, who will be arguing Stalin did nothing wrong, Stalin good. Now, this is simplified. They'll be able to take this in whatever direction they want. We will be doing 3 5-minute rounds. We have a moderator who will be timing the rounds. He will simply say round 1. First round will go to MakaroniX arguing Stalin did nothing wrong. When 1 minute is remaining, the moderator will verbally say 1 minute remaining. And when the 5 minutes is up, the moderator will say time is up. He will then say, Mobi, your turn. Time starts, 5 minutes. Same thing, 1 minute remaining, round 2, round 3. So he will keep track of the rounds and the time, and each person will get 3 full 5-minute rounds to argue their case, at the end of which a straw poll will be created, and the live audience will be given an opportunity to vote. And remember, you're encouraged to vote for who you think did better in the debate, not whose position you agree with. So if you're a Stalin supporter, but you think Mobi did better in the debate, you should vote for Mobi. If you hate Stalin, but you think MakaroniX made a better case, you should vote for MakaroniX. Ideally, you should vote based on who did best in the debate, but ultimately it's up to you who you vote for. There are no winners and losers, and both sides will receive the Master Debater special rank. So without further ado, I would like to ask my moderator, volunteer moderator, Comrade Seamus, are you ready to go, sir?
Yeah.
Okay, so I would just ask you to say round 1, MakaroniX, start the timer, 1 minute remaining, stop, etc. At your leisure, sir.
Yeah. MakaroniX, the word is to you. You have 5 minutes.
Yes. Thank you, Shogun. So I believe something that's really important when discussing Stalin and something worth emphasizing is that Stalin of 1960s, of 1970s, 1980s is not exactly the Stalin that we know, so to say, these days, that is in the 21st century and even in 90s for that matter. What I mean by this, of course, is that ever since the USSR was dissoluted, collapsed, however you want to call that, went, of course, in 1991, the Soviet archives were open basically to public. And this period was called the archive explosion, so-called archive boom. And the academic understanding and knowledge of Stalin in 1930s, especially in 1930s, progressed so much that even these days, people, as in historians who are anti-communist, self-proclaimed anti-communists, many people will be surprised by some of their takes, should we say, on Stalin, just because of how much literature has progressed. Unlike, for example, Robert Conquest, who is perhaps the most prominent anti-Stalinist of the Cold War period. For example, his book, The Red Terror, which was very influential, and some people still upheld it as this amazing piece of academic literature. These days we know that just what Conquest was doing isn't consistent. The numbers were basically speculations. You cannot really blame him because he couldn't know better, realistically, because he didn't have the archives. He could only speculate, oh, this much people died there or here for this or this reason. And that is, as I say, very important to note, because I think if we just look at some of liberal historians like Gerard Getty, Tauger, Thurston, and if you look at their works on the Stalin period, we can see that many people that quote-unquote Stalinists have been claiming for decades are in fact, at at least partially correct. Now, when it comes to Stalin himself, his policy is something more concrete. I'm sure you all heard this, but it is quite impressive that Stalin, ever since Lenin died, and then so we can say that Stalin, quote unquote, took power in 1928. And from 1928 to 1950s to early 1950s, in less than 3 decades, Stalin went from an agricultural, completely backwards, de facto illiterate country, should we say, to the second or arguably the first biggest superpower, both militarily and economically in the world. Russia never had this reputation. Russia always was seen as this backward, big, stumbling giant who, if he just tapped his toe, would fall over. But in this very short period of time, the reputation and reality completely changed in Russia and the entire USSR, of course. Something also worth noting is, for example, the so-called Stalin Constitution of 1936, which is really upheld as the most
1 minute remaining, sorry.
which is seen as perhaps the most progressive constitution in the world at that time, which sounds shocking, but really, if you read it, you can see that they abolished inequality, at least in political aspects, of women, and well, in all aspects, really, of people of different races, nationalities. Russia, before this period, was called the prison of nations, right? Because no other ethnicities had any political rights, and that, in this very short period, completely changed. I believe that's my time.
Yeah, you have 20 seconds, but
That's fine.
yeah, that was round 1. The word now goes to Modi. Second round, you can start now.
Okay, so I'm not going to attack what happened after Stalin died. I don't see that as, I think as the Chinese said, shortly before the death of Mao Zedong, they called the Russian system at that point revisionist. That is, following the Second Internationale method of, you could say, I guess, a somewhat democratic socialism or democracy going towards socialism before they reached the state capitalism that happens now. But what I will say is that you're absolutely right in the fact that illiterate farmers were not the best of manufacturing overseers, and the fact that in the revolution, the Red-White Revolution of 1917-18, that all those who weren't illiterate farmers, those of the serf class, were wholesale slaughtered. This is why literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were left to starve to death in some of the harshest climate that man can see. And then, that lasted obviously until 1921 when the new economic plan was set in place, which solved the socialist dilemma, which is what the anarcho-capitalists see as a problem too, the free rider movement. That is, if somebody takes all your stuff and it's redistributed to you, you get less of it back. Why put anything in at all? The new economic plan was set in place to allow some level of industrialization and singular ownership happened to begin with before Stalin got rid of it by the time, Lenin died of his stroke and other problems in 1924. Now, the moral relativism and monstrous incarnation that was Stalin, and further promoted by Trotsky, who said problems of revolutionary morality are fused with the problems of revolutionary strategy and tactics, is obviously shown in what happened afterwards, once Stalin did take power. By 1939, all the leaders of the old Soviet system, the council system, were shown in show trials and publicly executed or later assassinated, as Trotsky was in 1940 in Mexico. What else happened? Well, Stalin ended up going against the express word of Lenin with allowing collectivization to happen, since his brutal dictatorship didn't solve the socialist dilemma that the new economic plan did solve, at least for a time. I think that this is an efficiency problem, since generally speaking, Marxists follow a method of historical materialism, and so pragmatism, generally speaking, is how you see any morality go about as a result. It's obvious that Stalin didn't let the new economic plan run long enough to let proper industrialization to happen. This led to the collectivization of the entire nation, which led to at least 10 million deaths of the population, the show trials, as said before, of most of the Soviet leadership, and of a host of other problems. We could go on for hours about the prison camps of Kolyma, where Soviet civilians were forced to work in negative 40-degree weather in plain clothes without shoes or socks or anything else. These are some of the ethical problems and the efficiency problems that I have with Stalin. I think that he's evil for doing such things, even if they brought about an eventual industrialization. Some other things that I find Stalin to have done wrong and led to some real issues is that not only were the show trials brought forward and not only were these people killed wrongfully, there was an international
1 minute
organization.
remaining.
Thank you. There's an international organization that was brought about by Trotsky to, in fact, investigate the legitimacy of the death of Zinoviev, Komenev, and other such leaders of the Russian Revolution at the time. This was brought about, the leader of which was the pragmatist John Dewey, who is probably one of the most famous American philosophers in history, probably the only original one as well. And they found out that by 1938, with the trial of 21 with Bukharin, Rykov, and Yagoda, the former head of the NKVD, that most of these trials and most of the people who fell under Stalin were forced to confess under torture. I don't see how any system, regardless of the results, can be good when it requires forced confessions under torture, the mass collectivization and death of the populace, even if they're making the large
Your time has
jump.
expired.
Okay, thank you.
May I?
Yeah, sure.
So
You may start.
yes. The first point about kulaks, I didn't quite understand because this was apparently in the 20s. But no one, I believe, claims that the famine which happened, the Volga famine, so-called, in 1920s, was caused by the Soviet regime. I mean, the consensus is, and this isn't even debatable, that the 1920 famine was unfortunately caused by the Civil War and whatnot. Now you go on talk about the NFP, and this is very interesting. The NFP is often made to be, thank you, Shogun, is made to seem like it's this very prosperous period where, there was no famine, there was no like shortages of food and whatnot, and then this is compared to the collectivization period. In fact, this is not true. During the NEP, also the reason why NEP was implemented in the first place is because of how kind of ideological, but we won't get into that. But in fact, during the NEP, there was a shortage of food in 1924, there was a shortage of food in 1925, in 1927 to 8. So even after Lenin died, these problems were chronic to Russia. And especially after, we have to know, of course, or should I say acknowledge that before that World War I happened, which Russia lost. And then they had the terrible, a very unfair treaty, should we say, of Brest-Litovsk. And then as a civil war, of course, that they will have shortages of food in this period. Collectivization, in fact, there was a huge project in 1930 where they collectivized one area of the Soviet Union. They just they just made a big state, to be fair, a state-owned, but nonetheless a collective farm. And that farm in 1930 to 1931 produced double the expected amount of wheat. So what Soviets were doing, they made an experiment, it worked out, they doubled in that area the grain production. And as far as they knew, this was the most effective and the best method of increasing grain production. And that's why collectivization started in the first place. Now, many peasants protested this, but nowhere near as much as people often say. And in fact, of all the protests, only about 2%, or on average, I believe it was 6% of the revolts were put down with force. That is to say, 94% of them were not. They were peacefully solved, be it with concessions from the government or just a solution of some other sort. And many peasants willingly just form these collective farms, because it doesn't really, some people did hoard the grain, some people did kill horses and other livestock. This was mostly kulaks, it should be noted, because kulaks were the people who had all the livestock. The normal peasant maybe had a horse or two. Kulaks had basically all the livestock, and this was the big problem with kulaks. They didn't want to share all the things that they had, because it wasn't in their interest. Because
1 minute remaining.
Thank you. Because, well, the other peasants had basically nothing. About the purges, I mean, I have only a minute left, but there are a lot of interpretations about the purge, and specifically the trials, right? For example, Davies, what's his name? Well, Davis is his surname. He was on the trials. He was American ambassador, and he was on the trials every single day. He attended every single day of the trials for Bukharin, Zioniev, and I'll post his quote here. He says, "With an interpreter at my side, I followed the testimony carefully. Naturally, I must confess that I was predisposed to the credibility of the testimony of these defendants. Viewed objectively, however, and based upon my experience in the trial of cases and the application of the tests of credibility which past experience had afforded me, I arrived at the reluctant conclusion that the state had established its case," etc., etc.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Mobi, you have the word.
Okay,
You
this is
can
the
start.
second 5-minute round, correct? Just want to make sure.
Yeah.
So after Kamenev and Zinoviev were out of power by 1926, and I will concede that nobody has control over nature, and that Russia was going through incredibly hard times, from 1917 until about 1927. As far as my understanding was, the NEP, or New Economic Plan, was part of Marxist ideology that you have to go through a method of capitalism before you can reach socialism and thus communism. The power to produce is powerful and good. However, like you said, we can move on from that. Another issue that I have with Stalin. Stalin ended up forming a cult of personality in 1928. This is when he kicked out all other leaders of the revolution. And it went so far as scientists such as S.G. Shumelin saying, "It is not our job to study economics, but to change it. We are bound by no laws." This is an obvious refutation of any sort of scientific method of deriving truth from observation of the natural world, and turns it into something much more damning, telling others what is right, regardless of reality. This can be seen further in the BBC documentary Hypernormalization, by which we see the extent of what happened to Russia, let's say, after the Stalin era. But anyway, yes, by 1927, farmers refused to trade food for goods, or for rubles, as the currency had become worthless. And it did lead to food hoarding. Why wouldn't they? And Stalin eventually had to send out 30,000 armed party members to steal the food back, as it was their right. They had the power. Stalin's government then set up watchtowers to look over fields to make sure no one hoarded grain ever again, even if it led to those farmers starving. This led to an even lower incentive for the farmers to plant crops, which resulted in terrible harvests during 1928. This allowed the Andrew Mellon American, the National Gallery of Andrew Mellon to actually come about, since Russia had to sell the majority of their treasure and relics to feed their soldiers, to feed the proletariat. And of course, in 1929, collectivization starts, which happened without debate or consensus, since during the Civil War in Russia, the Soviet Council system essentially lost its democratic value, as those who were against the party were summarily executed or forced out of the system. Before that, of course, even members of the bourgeoisie were allowed to be represented in the Soviet Council, even if they didn't wish to be represented. They shunned it. This collectivization of about 105 million people, which was 3/4 of the Russian population, was called by Leszek Kolakowski, a historian from Poland, obviously, probably the most warlike operation ever conducted by a state against its own citizens. And this is after the Holocaust, mind you. Besides the around 10 million who refused to collectivize, around 10 million were sent to Siberia, to areas like Kolyma, which is where, the Russians hit gold, or, of course, what is commonly known as Nazinsky Island, Cannibal Island, where 6,000 people died in 3 months, committing cannibalism on people to survive, since they were only given 200 grams of flour, wheat flour, for the first 3 days, and then were shot at by the guards for fun until, of course, they were saved. We haven't gotten yet to 1930 to 33, which is
1
where...
minute remaining.
It should also be said that this collectivization, this forced unilateral collectivization, led to the death of nearly half of all farm animals in Russia, which did nothing more but increase the amount of suffering on its population. Why Stalin thought that he had the authority to do such things in such a system, I think can be relegated back to this will to power that he obviously had, this paranoia. This is why he killed all other leaders of the Soviet Revolution by the time, before World War II even started. All those people that he took pictures with are now people who don't even exist in the pictures, as it's been shown with the release of the Soviet archives, that before Photoshop existed, Stalin was already Photoshopping people out of existence. That's it.
Thank you for your time. Macaroni, you ready? You can start now.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, I should clarify the number of people who died. I'm guessing in Holodomor, because I don't see where else would people say that 10 million people died. The latest study I know of concluded that 2.6 million people died, which is about like 5 times less than you said, or 4 times. Second of all, this whole argument that Stalin brutally suppressed his peasants and whatnot completely falls apart when, again, we should look at the statistic which I posted earlier, and that is that only 2% on average, that 2% of the rebellions, I suppose, were actually suppressed by violence, even if what you said was true. If you look at the grand scheme of things, it was very minor. So like Dalger says here, the overall data from 1931 OGPU report shows the same pattern of the 13,754 disturbances listed. Only 150 of them, according to the document, were insurrections involving military action by armed protesters. This is, of course, a large number of rebellions that did not represent serious resistance, but it was still only a small fraction of the total number of protests. The OGPU forcibly suppressed a larger share, but still a small minority, as can be seen in Table 1. In Table 1, you can see that well, you can see what was just said there. Also, about the purge overall, Stalin, in fact, was very, should we say, disappointed about the purge. For example, we have to realize, first of all, that Stalin wasn't in charge of the purge. Stalin wasn't in political position to do that. He was the general secretary of the party. All the information he was getting was coming from the NKVD. And the person who was the head of the NKVD was Yezhov, right? So, for example, Yezhov, on one of the meetings, Stalin, so Yezhov said this: "Comrades, as a result of the verification of party documents, we expel more than 200,000 members of the party." And Stalin says, interrupts, like, "Oh, very many." And Yezhov said, "Yes, very many, I will speak about this." And then Stalin again interrupts and says, "If we expelled only 300,000 and 600 former Trotskyists and Zionivists, it would be a bigger victory." So in fact, Stalin was criticizing the head of the NKVD for expelling too many people. Also, another interesting thing is, if you read the report that Beria made, which I'm again sending in the channel, on Yezhov, you can see that they ironically basically concede everything that you're saying. But the fact of the matter is that this was never planned. They're saying these terrible things were happening. The troikas, which were supposed to review the punishments which NKVD was doing, were completely penalized by the NKVD. Yezhov himself got thousands of letters from innocent people who were unfortunately killed in the terror, and this was completely ignored, etc., etc. This wasn't Stalin. Stalin, if anything, as is shown in this his so-called inaudible remark, was deeply disturbed by this, should we say.
1 minute remaining.
Thank you. But another thing is, and this is something Davies again notes, Davies being the American ambassador who I mentioned before. Davies was surprised when Russia got invaded, for example. Unlike Austria, unlike Czechoslovakia, unlike Norway being the most popular example, you had Quisling, right? So basically you had people inside the country working for the invaders, Quisling, and this didn't happen in the Soviet Union, but that was an exception. Also look at Yugoslavia, look at Ustaše. Like, they created a country inside Yugoslavia only 4 days when the invasion of Yugoslavia started. These fifth column organizations, should we say, in countries, were the norm and not the exception. The USSR was an exception for not having them. So even if the purge, had definitely its flaws, once Yezhov was gone and once Beria was in power, this was plain sailing. There was no terror after that.
Thank you for your time.
So where I get the report of 10 million people dying in the collectivization project in Russia was from Stalin himself, who confided to Winston Churchill at Yalta that 10 million died in the course of collectivization. Now, we can go by historians or we can go from the horse's mouth. I'll leave that up to you. Now, I will get to the Ukrainian death, of the Holodomor of 1930 to 1933. And the numbers do range between 1.5 to 40 million. It's very hard to get any real numbers about it. It did lead to, the incompetent logisticians and malevolence of, like you said, Yerezov, did lead to a mass death. Of course, this doesn't talk about in 1934 where Stalin did, in fact, execute or have 5,000 political dissidents executed, by his own hand per se. Let me see. By 1938, all of those people were killed. The Dewey Commission, supporters of Trotsky, set up an investigation commission to investigate the charges levied. against Zinoviev, Komenev, etc. They found him to be not guilty. Quote, no attempt was made to ascertain truth. Confessions contradicted available facts. Trotsky never plotted anything he was accused of. And in those show trials where they were killed, 1,500 writers were killed, 110,000 Poles for some reason, and around 300,000 kulaks, as far as I can find out. And then this is from the Soviet archives. This is more towards the end of Stalin, from my notes, where about 1.6 million individuals were imprisoned in the Gulag system. 681,692 were shot between 1937 to 1938. This is shown by the killing fields of Kurapati and Bikuvina, which alone contained 200,000 corpses. Of course, the purge did happen, where 3,000 senior police officers were killed, 90% of all prosecutors in the justice system, 30,000 army officers, 80% of generals and colonels, 3 out of the 5 field marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, 8 out of 9 admirals, 50 out of 57 army corps commanders, 54 to 186 army divisional commanders, etc., etc. All 11 vice defense commissars, 98 out of 108 members of the Supreme Military Council, 98 out of 139 elected candidates from 1934 of the Communist Party were executed. Let me see. And it is confirmed that at least 1.5 million have died in that Gulag archipelago. Let me see. Besides that, I'd like to reiterate that Stalin, in his collectivization, did go against Lenin's thoughts himself. Lenin thought it was a terrible idea to collectivize, and the whole reason why he led the NEP was, in fact, to industrialize the nation so then they could have enough to socialize properly without leading to the mass starvation and death that happened. I don't think that a few granary fields receiving double the crop potential, which we can't really separate from, like I said before, the terrible, years of no, let's say, rain or something like that, could easily have brought about a different answer. And really, when you look at the entirety of how much was lost during the reign of Stalin, never mind what happened afterwards, I don't see an ability to call him a red herring, that all Stalin is a straw man, and that he was a puppet to Yazarev and Berien,
1
etc.
minute remaining.
This can be seen in the continuation of the Gulag system after Stalin's death, even during the thawing of the Soviet Union, where individuals who didn't have the internal passport system were taken off the streets with no ability to redress any problems and summarily sent to death camps in the north of Russia. Once again, I don't see the way that you can say anything about this man beyond the vile terrors that happened under his reign in spite of his rank and power. If the head of the General Soviet Committee is so weak that he can't constrain the police force under him, then he too is implicit in the damnation, or the system
Thank
itself.
you for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, let's set some things straight. If you look at the deaths in the... Oh god, my computer just lagged. Are you kidding me? Wait, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can.
My Discord just froze. Oh my god. Come on.
You all right?
No, please wait.
Yeah, sure.
I can't hear whoever's speaking.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
If anybody's having trouble,
Would it be fine
both
if I
parties
just...
try leaving and re-entering the room.
can
Solve
I
most
can I
problems.
restart my Discord? I'll be right back.
Yeah, no problem. Take your time. And if anyone's having trouble hearing each other, just leave and re-enter the room. Almost always solves it.
Thank you. Where's my task manager? Can't believe this happened. postmate.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're on the final round. We're about 3 from Mechatronics, and then we'll have the final closing round from Mobi.
Okay, I'm
We're
back.
just giving. Perfect. So whenever you're ready, sir.
Yeah, so I'm so sorry for that. I have no idea. Anyway, yeah. So to get something straight about the gulags, first of all, if you look at this chart from George Getty, the de facto best Sovietologist still alive, you can see that if anything, more people were released in the gulags, or at least equally were released as they died. The only period in which a lot, quote unquote, a lot of people died, or at least something that would be considered to be brutal or purposeful or anything, was during World War II. Only in 1942 did it skyrocket, really. For obvious reasons, of course. 1/6 of, at the end of the war, of Russian population was dead, and a huge portion of the country, everything from Leningrad to the Black Sea, was occupied. There was no food that could be produced sufficiently to feed the gulags. I mean, they even had problems in the military. So yeah, in the entirety of the Kulak system, I believe less than 1.5 million people died, and we are speaking here from 1924 to 1991. These numbers, I don't know. It sounds like you're saying that 1 million people died in 1 year. This is just factually not correct. Furthermore, you mentioned the military purge. I'm not. Well, regardless. The military purge is interesting because in fact by late 1939, 80% of officers who were removed from the position were installed back. So this wasn't detrimental military-wise, and certainly wasn't, something that completely crippled the Soviet Union. I'm guessing you're referring to that in context of World War II. And regardless, you had many people who came in the military positions like Chuikov, who were new officers, basically, who were extremely talented. In fact, the purge was supposed not to be this brutal thing, but in theory, in some ideal world, and this was realized to an extent, purge was supposed to remove, sort of cleanse the party of careerists and opportunists and whatnot. And so it is logical, if you look at it that way. At least some people who got in positions after the purge were actually people of, very very good people, should we say. Like Chuikov, I mentioned him. He was basically responsible for the victory at Stalingrad and the encirclement of the 4th Division and the 6th Division after that, etc., etc. And if we look, for example, at the precise numbers of how many people died per 1,000 in the gulags, you can see after the war, this is post-war and during the war, late World War II, you can see that in 1953, 3 people per 1,000 died in the gulags. Compared to that to French Devil's Island, so-called, where you had basically hundreds of people dying constantly, like every day, basically, and British colonies and their prisons there. Yes, I'm sorry about that. I can send you the exact link, and here, this is also from Getty. But I highlighted all the important things.
1 minute remaining.
Yeah, sorry. And what else? I don't exactly remember. I got this crash kind of boggled me up, but yeah. I don't. Okay. Also, you mentioned that Stalin didn't have control of the NKVD. This was an extremely complex situation, and in fact, after Yezhov was removed, which was relatively soon. This is, for example, what Getty, or not Getty, but Thurston also says. So he says, I will not simply imply, but will state outright that Yezhovchina, the Great Purge, was an aberration. Torture was uncommon until August 1937, when it became the norm. It ended abruptly with Beria's rise to head of the NKVD in late 1936. Mass arrests followed the same pattern, etc., etc. There was no this great terror, and as Thurston also knows in his other works, this, it was a terrible event, but it wasn't just power-hungry Stalin. And Stalin, in fact, and the Politburo managed to control the situation relatively quickly for what it was.
Yeah. Thank you for your time.
I think that's it.
Yeah, me too.
Is it? Damn.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Both 3 rounds. Yeah.
Mobius, thank you. This was terrific.
Yeah, I enjoy it too, and I hope to be better educated, and I'm fully looking forward towards there being a proper discussion on this at some point.
If I'm
Okay.
Yeah.
May I just point something out? If I'm not mistaken, did you watch this video perhaps?
That was one of them that I watched.
Yeah, because some of the points I recognize from that video. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Wait, is Shogun here? No, Shogun died.
Shogun, we're finished.
Oh, he's here. Sorry.
He
Thank
just came
you.
back.
Oh,
Sorry, guys, I just had to reset my connection briefly. So thanks so much for the debaters, for the audience, for Finbol's Commune, and everybody who joined the round table. We hope you'll stick around, check our other events, propose new debates. Now, I have a request. Is there anyone who can set up for me a straw poll in the recorded Stalin debate channel, which would simply have 2 options? One would be Mobi, and the other one would be MakaroniX. And then everyone can simply vote for who they think did best. And then we will, after that's been set up and we give it a minute, people can vote. We'll unmute everybody. We'll have an open discussion. Everybody can weigh in, ask questions to the debaters, tell us what you think of the debate, and then we'll announce the winner based on the straw poll. Is there anyone who knows how to set up the straw poll? Otherwise, I can just do a simple emoji poll.
I'm setting it up right now.
Yeah, you can do that. Terrific.
Thank you.
Okay. Here we go. Copy, pasting the link.